My very great honor to turn this over to Ms. Welcome. Rebekah, take it over.
Good evening all, and welcome to this evening's panel on U.S. foreign policy and security in Middle East and North Africa. My name is Rebekah Waller, and I'm a first-year student at Tufts this year. I am interested in international relations, statistics, and Arabic, and I'm honored to be a part of the EPIIC 2014 Colloquium. This program has opened up incredible doors for me, and one of them being the opportunity to sit here on this panel. This is truly a special night. We are joined by some of the leading scholars and policymakers in this field. Tonight's panel features Mr. Bernardino, the EU Special Representative of the Southern Mediterranean region, Dr. Augustus Norton, right here. He's a professor at Boston University teaching international relations and anthropology, as well as a visiting professor in politics of the Middle East at the University of Oxford and a fellow at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. Dr. Tamara Cofman, Wittes, Senior Fellow and Director of the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute. And then, last but not least, Dr. Dafna, Deputy Director of Studies and the inaugural Leon Panetta Fellow at the Center for New American Security. Thank you all for being here tonight. This past September, we kicked off EPIIC with Scott Anderson's remarkable book, Lawrence in Arabia. This non-fictional narrative chronicles the intertwined paths of four men and many others who played significant roles in the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. Through these different perspectives, Anderson captures the, quote, imperial folly of Western powers that went into the making of what we know today as the Middle East. As Dr. Elizabeth Thompson highlighted in her address last night, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the First World War, and we are witnessing the consequences of the Western intervention in the MENA region still today. Next, we directed our attention to the crisis in Syria, and then to the revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. We discussed the future of the Gulf monarchies and the precarious nature of Lebanese politics and society. We studied the history of Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Arab-Israeli relations. We debated Iran's nuclear ambitions and the future of Iraqi Kurdistan. As Sherman always stresses, there are multiple layers of complexity to every issue we study. Throughout all of these topics we addressed, despite their nuances and distinct challenges, the role of the United States has been and continues to be most critical. Strategic and ideological narratives in the past century have compelled U.S. involvement in MENA affairs. And now, more than ever before, the U.S. seeks to establish its proper role in a region undergoing intense upheaval. Has the so-called Arab Spring of recent years provided the United States with a window of opportunity to reassess and re-engage with the MENA region? Will the U.S. capitalize on this opportunity? And if so, how? These are some of the questions we hope to address this evening. We will begin the panel with initial presentations by each of the panelists. Each panelist has agreed to limit their presentations to 12 minutes to ensure we have ample time for debate and discussion following these presentations. Members of the audience are encouraged to come forward and ask questions of the panelists. It is our hope that tonight's panel will be a constructive and informative dialogue on U.S. policy and presence in the MENA region, and will provide a glimpse into the future of U.S.-MENA relations. As I introduce, and as some of my classmates introduce each panelist, keep in mind that these descriptions only brush the surface of these individuals' remarkable careers. First, we will hear from Mr. Bernardino Leon. I'd like to welcome my fellow classmate, Maddie Pelton, forward to present the Dr. Jean Mayer Award.
Hello, my name is Maddie Pelton, and I'm a sophomore and a member of this year's EPIIC Colloquium. As you heard earlier, the Dr. Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award was established to honor distinguished scholars and practitioners who use their positions of power and knowledge to tackle some of the world's most pressing problems. Bernardino Leon embodies this model. Mr. Leon is a Spanish diplomat and politician who is currently serving as the European Union Special Representative for the Southern Mediterranean region. Mr. Leon was appointed to this position after the Arab uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and Syria in 2011. And since then, has been working on a strengthened and comprehensive European Union response to the recent developments in the Arab world. Prior to this, Mr. Leon played a key role in the Middle East peace process, serving as a personal advisor to the EU Special Representative for Middle East peace process negotiations. Recently, Mr. Leon was involved in the August 2013 negotiating process between former Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi and the liberal opposition. Mr. Leon worked intensively with Ambassador Burns to bring about genuine reconciliation and amendments to the Egyptian constitution in preparation for the upcoming parliamentary and presidential elections. Mr. Leon, we are delighted and honored to have you here with us today. And as a token of our gratitude, the 2014 EPIIC Colloquium class would like to honor you with the Dr. Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award in recognition of your dedicated diplomacy in strengthening democratic transitions, encouraging dialogue, and diminishing tensions in complex areas of the world.
Thank you very much. It's an immense honor to be here today and to receive this award, but I'm afraid I have only 12 minutes, so I will focus on the Middle East and probably first question I have and that probably you will have is why a new official is discussing here tonight American policy in the region. But the truth is that since I was appointed, I started to work and facilitate, mediate, especially in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, probably the three most complicated cases, and are waiting. I've been working very closely with the Americans, and for different reasons. In Tunisia, because probably Europe has a stronger position there, in the sense that it was asked to take the lead. In Egypt, it's a different case. We were not expected, but finally an American-European team worked together, but we took the lead, and it was not easy for the United States in the last months. I think it was unfair, but the different actors had complicated views about American foreign policy in Egypt. So I think I have a good experience and a good perspective, and as it has been reminded a few minutes ago, last August, Bill Burns and I, we were together with Khalid Al-Attiyah, the Qatari foreign minister, and Sheikh Abdallah, the Emirati foreign minister, trying to avoid the Egyptian government storming the squares, which, as you know, we couldn't do. Anyway, I would like to speak from the point of view of the West. I think when it comes to the Arab Spring, we should keep together. It's very important, as Admiral Stavridis said before. The first question we should pose is, are we necessary in the region? We have so many actors going there. And my answer is yes. The United States and the European Union are absolutely needed in the region for three reasons. Number one, because the depolarization which is affecting these countries is also affecting the international community. So most of the international actors relevant in the region are taking sides or forced to take sides. And the only ones that seem to be in the middle of the stage are the United States and the European Union. The second reason is because we need to tackle the economic challenge. It's probably the most difficult and the most important one. And only the United States and the European Union are able to really help to transform the economy of the region. We know that the Gulf countries and others have a lot of financial muscle and capacity to help, but they cannot transform the economies in the region. They cannot provide the markets. They cannot provide kind of economic support these countries need. And the third reason is because what is at stake is the role of the civil society that is at the end the main protagonist in the region, and democracy. And here again, the United States and the European Union have a unique position. The challenge is complex. On the one hand, it is not a symmetric challenge. We know that there are some similarities in the region, but differences are more important than what they have in common. So we could imagine a line going from Tunisia to the east, and the intensity of the geopolitical challenge will increase following this line. So Tunisia is very little percentage of a geopolitical challenge, and I would say 95-97% a transition, a democratic transition, where democracy and the political element is the most important element. And if you continue with this line to Libya, Egypt, where the geopolitical aspect is around 50% and another 50% the political challenge, the democratic transition. And then you reach Syria, where the geopolitical aspect is probably 95% and the political would be around 5%. So, despite these differences, we have two pairs of questions which are relevant in all these countries and where the United States and Europe have to work together. One is the connection between the economy, the socio-economic challenge, and the political challenge. And the other one is the connection between security and human rights. Europeans has evoked these 4 challenges, so I think it's not necessary to elaborate. But the other important one is the connection between values and interests. I think for many years we faced a problem, both Americans and Europeans in the region. It is that our values and interests were conflicting. I think it's important that now we can have a coherent, fully coherent policy there. It is very important because of course the interests, the strategic challenge is still very important, even though the United States will need less energy from the region. Still, Europe, from an energy point of view, is an absolutely crucial region. Also, from the point of view of security, is important for the United States and for the European Union. And then the migration challenge is less important for the United States, but it's very important for us, just to mention 3 factors. So, values, and I fully agree with Bill when he said that dictatorship and regimes which are not democratic will not bring medium and long-term stability. So we need to enhance our presence in the region, and we need to do a lot of things. let me mention just 3 or 4. Number one, we have to change, and when I say we, I mean the European Union in this case, we have to change the institutional relationship with countries in the region. What we have had so far is a weak, relatively important, also relatively weak regional policy with 2 projects, 2 initiatives. The first one, the Barcelona process, and the second one, the Union for the Mediterranean. But today this is not enough. Today we need to offer a real perspective for a country like Tunisia, a country like Gambia, could be a full democracy. I'm hopeful that it will be a full democracy in a few months. And we need to offer a European perspective for Tunisia, using Jabotinsky's expression for Israel, the idea of the iron wall. We have the responsibility to build an iron wall in Tunisia to protect Tunisia, because the challenges for this country are going to be huge, and it is also equally important to preserve a model that for many years probably will be the only real full democracy in the region. Number 2, we have to work in the economy, and we have to be more ambitious, much more ambitious. We need to invest, we need to help to revive tourism, which is not going to be easy in the context of instability in the region. And we have to do it together with others. Let's take, there are many figures which have been used regarding Egypt, but if we use a conservative one, let's say that Egypt needs 20 billion, 25 billion to recover, to revive its economy. There's no single actor or no group of actors in the world, group of Gulf countries or European Union or the United States together. There are no actors that can address these economic challenges by themselves. They will need the full presence of the international community, and even the huge team led by the IMF, the World Bank, will not be able to, or will have a lot of difficulties to address this economic challenge. The third one is the civil society. We are seeing, despite this incredible awakening and this situation, which is probably reversible, the civil society in these countries is not going to accept any more things that were accepting just a few months, a couple of years ago. But it is going to be an incredible challenge, because other actors are not really important as to the civil society. And I'm afraid that only Americans and Europeans can do it, but it is going to be very, very difficult. We have to probably see the Maghreb and the Mashrek from different perspectives. The Maghreb, more European, will be easier because the Tunisian example, as I said, the Tunisian model is going to be the only one, but Morocco will move in the right direction, and although Algeria will probably take more time, Algeria has some assets, has middle class, has relatively important role of women in society, relatively plural media. Transition in Algeria, when it will start, will be easier than in other places. So we have to work on the Maghreb as best option we have. The Mashrek will be more difficult, but there the key is Libya. And Libya, in Libya the situation, as you know, is extremely difficult, but it's probably the main challenge for the United States and the European Union, as I said before. Only if we work together it will be possible to address all these challenges.
Mr. Leon, for your statement. Next, I'd like to welcome forward my fellow classmate, the legendary Sookrit Malik to present the Dr. Jim Meyer Award to Dr. Augustus Richard Malik.
My name is Sookrit Malik. I'm a member of the 2014 EPIIC Colloquium. Today, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Augustus Richard Norton. Dr. Norton is a professor at Boston University with appointments both in international relations and the Anthropology department, and a fellow at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. Dr. Norton has served 2 combat tours in Vietnam as an airborne infantry officer and has later served as an unarmed UN observer with the UN Truce Supervision Organization in southern Lebanon. He joined the West Point faculty in 1981 as a professor of political science and retired in 1993 to join the faculty at Boston University. Dr. Norton's scholarship and research spans an extraordinary 3 decades. He is focused on intersectarian relations in the Middle East, political reform and opposition in authoritarian states, and on reformist Muslim thought. Dr. Norton is the director of the Institute for Iraq Studies and the co-editor of Princeton University's Muslim Politics series. He has written several outstanding books, including Hezbollah, A Short History and Civil Society in the Middle East, and is often published in prestigious publications like The Foreign Policy, Current History, and International Spectator. Dr. Norton has been a long-time friend and participator in the EPIIC Colloquium, and we are honored to have him here with us today. In recognition of your distinguished career of scholarship that masterfully combines the best of theory and practice, and for your transmission of knowledge through years of impassioned teaching, it is my honor to present to you the Dr. John Mayer Award of Global Citizenship on behalf of the EPIIC class of 2014.
Thank you very much, and anyone who knows me over the years will know that any award I get is not attributable to my own efforts in a significant part, but that of my co-pilot, the Lampelos Norton, who's with me tonight. And she keeps me out of trouble, so thank you for coming tonight. I thought I would focus my remarks on Syria. You're going to be hearing more about Syria in the continuation of the conference, and you've heard about Syria already, but I want to offer some insights and a couple of modest recommendations for how the U.S. might, if you will, attenuate some of the difficulties in Syria. This is a horrible problem. In many ways, I think it's the linchpin for regional security. And I think, unfortunately, it may well be possible that the worst is yet to come. I doubt that many of us here tonight imagine that the civil war in Syria will end soon, especially in light of the recent failure of the Geneva II talks. Even if by some miracle of international comity, collective moral outrage, and well-applied pressure, the belligerents consented to put down their guns and subdue their well-grounded fears that their opponents will seek to slaughter them. The sheer task of rebuilding housing, resurrecting cities and towns and villages will be a massive challenge. We know from other cases, notably from Iraq and Lebanon, that people displaced by war do not blithely return to their former homes. In Lebanon, the Shuf region south of Beirut, where a Christian minority has long been present, even now, a generation after Lebanon's 15-year civil war has ended, many Christians only return to visit their property, not to live on it. Lebanon today is a heterogeneous society, yes, but areas that were once marked by diversity are now much more homogeneous, as any visitor to Hamra in Beirut will attest. Baghdad's districts offer a similar picture of erased pluralism, even in parts of the Iraqi capital famous for secularity. How can Syria be any different, despite nostalgic memories of richly diverse urban neighborhoods and circles of friends who scarcely knew one another's professional background? Of course, the Syrian war will not end soon. Notwithstanding the long overdue demonstration of consensus in the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2139, which was passed in late February, which underlines basic humanitarian principles, condemns the targeting of civilians, and demands strong language for the Security Council that the government allow humanitarian relief operations. This is a singular example, if you will, of consensus. Unfortunately, if agreement is fleeting between international and regional rivals, dissension between opposition militias is rife, and not only on ideological grounds. Funders and arms suppliers, notably Qatar, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, often spur in coordination. And let's not forget private donors underwriting entrepreneurial gangs that often stage and video sensational feats of cruelty to impress would-be benefactors. Whatever unity of purpose against the hated regime exists in theory, unity of action has been less obvious. Some middle-class members of this audience may know my early work on civil society in the Middle East, but the mayhem in Syria reminds us that civil wars spawn war societies, not simply jihadists and millenarians committed to gestating a new world through blood, but militias, opportunists, criminals and merchants who prosper in suffering, who sometimes stand to gain more by conflict continuing than by supporting initiatives to bring the bloodshed to a close. This suggests that even if the government in Damascus suddenly collapses, which might happen, who knows, it is hardly given that fighting between militia domains and scattered enclaves would end. For great powers, like the United States, averse to putting boots on the ground, conscious of the slippery slope of intervention, one would hope that there would be at least more strenuous efforts to coordinate not just badly needed humanitarian aid, but the arms flow in order to attenuate the fragmentation of opposition forces. This is a serious point, and it's one I think that should have had and must have more attention from the U.S. government. When I reflect back on the Lebanese Civil War, which I experienced close up for parts of its duration, I'm reminded that even in the midst of terrible killing, and let's remember that in Lebanon, upwards of 150,000 died out of a population of about 3 million at the time, key Lebanese institutions survived and functioned. The central bank, the education ministry. Over the course of the Civil War, baccalaureate examinations were administered every single year except 1982, when the Israelis invaded Lebanon in a kind of star-crossed adventure. Even the defense ministry, in a country in which army units had defected to one side or another, continued to function. You would go to the defense ministry in Yarzi, and this whole operation was going on. They were picking officers from factions to go abroad for training and that kind of thing. My point is not to celebrate Lebanon, but to point out that it's much worse in Syria, where what national institutions in Syria will retain or easily recapture their legitimacy? That's a crucial question, and it does not yield a reassuring answer in my view. Institutions are going to have to be built from scratch in many cases. It's far more difficult than Iraq was and continues to be, in my view. Nor must we forget that Pax Syriana prevailed in Lebanon, especially from 1990 with the cooperation of the U.S., until most Syrian armed elements exited following the mass protest provoked by the assassination of Rafiq al-Hariri in 2005. Will there be a Pax Saudiya, Pax Iraniya in Syria? Both seem unlikely prospects. For decades, I've been impressed by how the borders drawn in Sykes-Picot following the First World War have become instantiated in the Middle East, but I must admit that I'm now doubtful that the borders in the Levant will remain unchanged. That's one of the gifts that will keep on giving from Syria, in my view. If nothing else, the massive flows of people fleeing from Syria, fleeing within Syria, will impose change. Bill Burns referred to approximately 9 million Syrians who have been internally displaced or have fled across borders in quest of relative safety. Syrian Kurds in the northeast are already building deeper ties to their Iraqi brethren along the porous boundary with Iraq, particularly Al-Anbar province. Tribal, commercial, marriage, and sectarian ties bind populations and render the notion of a border really quite a fiction. 1 million Syrians are now refugees in Lebanon. Most of them are Sunni Muslims. Lebanon only has a population of 4 million people. Moreover, the legacy of impoverishment imposed by 40 years of Syrian domination, particularly in parts of Lebanon, like the north, have left those parts of the country with weak political institutions and diminished leaders. And it's not surprising that with that refugee population, we see a growth, a burgeoning of jihadists, homegrown and imported, who have been growing in number almost by the day. Of course, enmity has been fueled by the intervention of Hezbollah in Syria, and the now familiar reports of car bombs and other assaults in Lebanon are a constant reminder that what happens in Syria doesn't necessarily stay in Syria. The title of this panel is U.S. Foreign Policy and Security. It is hard to ignore, in my view, the obvious dangers and profound human cost of the continuing pandemonium. As a minimum, the recent UN resolution, albeit a small step, may offer some promise of future cooperation. My hope is it's not a high watermark for cooperation, but instead a model for future dialogue and consensus. That's a small reed upon which to build hope, but I think we need to do that. It's probably going to be with us for a long time to come, and for the students who are here tonight interested in the Middle East, I'm afraid that Syria and the consequences of the ongoing Syria war are going to in significant measure define how you understand and what you do vis-a-vis the Middle East. It's very sad. I have no big answers, only a couple of very small suggestions. Thank you very much.
Next, I would like to invite Sookrit and Malik again to present Dr. Tamara Cofman Wittes with another Dr. Jean Mayer Award.
Dr. Tamara Cofman Wittes is a senior fellow and director at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. She served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs from 2009 to 2012, where she coordinated the US policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East. In addition, Dr. Wittes was an overseer of Middle East Partnership Initiative and has served as the Deputy Special Coordinator for Middle East Transitions, playing a central role in organizing the US response to the Arab revolutions. She served as the Middle East Specialist at the US Institute for Peace and is a Director of Programs at the Middle East Institution in Washington. She has taught courses in international relations and security studies at Georgetown University and is the author of The Freedom's Unsteady March, America's Role in Building Arab Democracy. Her career has made her a leading voice in US foreign policy in the MENA region, and we are honored to have her participate in our panel tonight. Dr. Wittes, for your distinguished, thoughtful, and dedicated contributions to promoting democracy, peace, and prosperity in the Middle East, it is my honor to present to you the Dr. John Mayer Award for Global Citizenship on behalf of the EPIIC class of 2014.
Sherman, to Rebekah, to Sookrit, and for this meaningful award, for a chance to have a discussion with all of you tonight. And I really want to congratulate the EPIIC Colloquium on an incredible program that they've put together for this week, and I'm only sorry that I have missed so much of it. There's been a great deal of discussion about whether the United States is undergoing a fundamental shift in its approach to the region. And so what I wanted to do tonight is maybe zoom out a bit and speak broadly about some of the structural factors both in the region and importantly here at home that I think are shaping America's future engagement in the Middle East. We've already heard references tonight to America turning the page on more than a decade of intensive military engagement in the broader Middle East, the growing prospect of U.S. energy independence, the idea of a pivot or a rebalancing to Asia, and I think Bill Burns, with whom I had the great honor to serve in the State Department, explained well why the United States is not, indeed cannot, turn away from this geostrategic region. But for three reasons that I want to discuss with you tonight, I think that this is a very fraught environment for U.S. policy, and especially for the positive agenda that Ambassador Burns laid out tonight: pluralism, economic opportunity, peace and security. There are forces that I think are driving the United States toward an agenda that is weighted away from such positive, proactive steps and toward reactive steps. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how I see that and what I think we can do about it. The first and most obvious factor, of course, is that this region is undergoing a political earthquake. That is the background to everything that you're talking about this week. I'll just note that the upheaval we're witnessing today is the result of very deep-seated changes in society, in global economics, in technology, that have been underway for many years, and that burst onto the scene in practical terms in December 2010. But these trends exist everywhere in the Middle East and North Africa, in places that have seen political upheaval and places that haven't. These forces, these demands for change are not going away, and we're not done. So for the United States, with global interests, a relative rebalancing away from the Middle East would require a region that is experiencing a relative degree of stability that would enable the U.S. to turn some of its attention elsewhere. For half a century, the United States has essentially been a defender of the status quo regional order, working with a coalition of regional partners with whom we had basic agreement on the nature of balance of power in the region that we supported, the nature of the state order that we supported. Today in the Middle East, there is no status quo regional order to defend. And in an environment where there is no status quo, every actor in the region is a revisionist. And that includes the United States today. So that, I think, is the first structural factor we have to confront. The second factor is a direct consequence, and it gets to America's relationships with its key actors, key partners in this region. It used to be that the United States and its major partners were mostly on the same page. Not on every issue, to be sure. There were significant disagreements and tensions at various points, but on the broad objectives and a degree of partnership over the nature of American engagement in the region. Today, I think there are some pretty fundamental differences between the United States and key partners in the Middle East on some really big questions. What caused this political earthquake? What are the primary threats facing the United States and facing its regional partners today. What must be done to return the regional order to a more stable order? We've seen those differences emerge between the US and partners in the Gulf. We've seen it emerge between the United States and Israel over issues like Bahrain, Egypt, Iraq. The president's trip to Riyadh, which is coming up at the end of March, will be very important to intensify dialogue between the United States and some of its regional partners on these and other issues. But these differences are pretty fundamental. They may represent, in the longer term, a divergence in interests that cannot be papered over. At the very least, they are challenging to work through. And until we see some greater common ground emerge between the US and regional partners, we're going to continue to see a few things that make the American role in the region problematic. We're going to continue to see American partners expressing a lot of anxiety about American intentions. We're going to continue to see them engaging in their own decision-making and their own actions that sometimes complicate or undermine American objectives. And we're going to continue to see them engage in very active advocacy toward the White House on behalf of their preferred policy approaches. And by the way, those policy approaches don't always agree with one another. Now, I think what's interesting so far is that in the face of this anxiety and pressure, ambivalence, and yet demand from regional partners for a greater American role in the Middle East, President Obama and his administration have responded by turning this demand in the direction of 3 high-stakes diplomatic initiatives on the Iranian nuclear issue, on Syrian chemical weapons, and more broadly, a political effort to resolve the conflict in Syria, and on Arab-Israeli peace. This is, I think, quite a feat in the face of the pressure that the administration has been experiencing to say essentially, yes, we understand that you want more American engagement in the region, but it's not going to be the kind of engagement we've seen over the last decade. It's going to be primarily diplomatic. And it's going to be focused, as the president said in his UN General Assembly speech, more narrowly on American security interests. I'm going to argue to you, though, that I think in the end, that's probably not enough. There's a third factor that I want to bring up, which is really made in the USA. And that is the historically significant level of reluctance we see today amongst the American public to engage in world affairs. Now, presumably, all of you sitting in this room have come to this conference, and you're here because you believe that America has an important role to play in global affairs, and that it's in American interest to play an active role in global affairs. I don't know if it will surprise you or not to learn that nearly 40% of the American public, according to the Chicago Council, disagrees with you and believes that it is in the interest of the United States, quote, to stay out of world affairs, unquote. And if you had any doubt about the resurgence of this desire to de-emphasize or turn away from the world beyond our borders, you saw it emerge fiercely in our brief debate last September about the prospect of military engagement in Syria. I spoke to one member of Congress who got thousands of calls about the prospective vote on authorization to use military force in Syria. 2 were in favor. Now, what does this mean? It means that it is incredibly difficult for any administration, for us as a society, to mobilize, to invest in the moderation, the pluralism, the economic opportunity, the peace and security that Ambassador Burns just told us are necessary to stability in the Middle East. It is easier in this environment to mobilize public support to deal with crisis or to deal with threat. When I was in my final year in the State Department and we were dealing with the aftermath of the Arab Spring, we put a proposal in front of Congress for $700 million to provide support for democratic transitions and economic growth in the Arab Spring countries. We couldn't get $700 million out of Congress for that purpose. But I'm told by the State Department that the US government has now spent about $2 billion in humanitarian relief for Syrian refugees and displaced. So our current domestic environment makes it very difficult for us to make investments up front that could, and I have to emphasize the conditionality, could help reduce the need to pay at a higher price down the road. So I want to end my remarks with a message to you as informed, engaged citizens. You know that America's role in the world can take many forms. That intensive American involvement in global affairs is not necessarily a slippery slope to military intervention. We have to learn the lessons of the last decade plus of war, but we cannot allow them to paralyze us. As a country with global interests, we have a stake in how other countries manage their business, just as they have a stake in how we manage ours. They have a strong stake, for example, in whether we overcome our political dysfunction to raise our debt ceiling or pass a budget. And we understand that. We don't call it intervention, we call it global politics. You know, there was a Politico article that came out today in Politico magazine that called President Obama the ultimate realist. A president focused tightly on narrow American interests in the Middle East, Iranian nuclear weapons, Syrian chemical weapons, Arab-Israeli, preventing another Arab-Israeli conflagration, and staying out of messy things like Dick was just describing. But as is clear from the discussion we've already had tonight, that narrowing focus does not necessarily defend the United States from risk. We already see, certainly in the Washington world I inhabit, a growing concern over the jihadi resurgence and a readiness to contemplate, for example, a greater AFRICOM presence in North Africa to deal with al-Qaeda affiliates there, greater investments in counterterrorism across the region. And I think it's important, as we grapple with the security challenges in this region in turmoil, that we not lose sight of the need to make investments in the positive agenda that Ambassador Burns was talking about earlier tonight. In order to make that possible, I think it requires all of us to do the work. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wittes. The final presentation will be from Dr. Dafna Hochman-Rand. Dr. Rand, as I mentioned previously, is the Deputy Director of Studies and the inaugural Leon Panetta Fellow at the Center for New American Security. Her current research focuses on Middle East security and U.S. foreign policy, exemplified by her most recent book, Roots of the Arab Spring, Contested Authority and Political Change in the Middle East. Prior to joining the Center for New American Security, Dr. Rand served on the National Security Council staff, where her responsibilities included the global U.S. assistance efforts in support of democratic transitions, good governance, and rule of law. As part of Secretary Hillary Clinton's policy planning staff from 2010 to 2012, she covered the Middle East and North Africa region, contributing to the U.S. government's response to the Arab Spring, specifically the intervention in Libya and the U.S. response to the crisis in Syria. Dr. Rand also previously served on the professional staff of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and was the Foreign Affairs and Defense Legislative Assistant for Senator Frank Lautenberg in the period after September 11, where she worked on U.S. policy and security in Iraq and Afghanistan. Dr. Rand is one of the most promising of our nation's up-and-coming leaders in foreign policy, and we are honored to have her here with us tonight.
القرار حسب ما جميع الإعلام كان إنه يفصل بين فلسطين وإسرائيل. هذا بس إنه هي تشوف إن الجدار سلب الأراضي.
Well, first of all, I apologize that as the last speaker, I'm actually not showing a riveting movie. So that's sort of a tease, and I'm sorry because I know it's really late. We've heard a lot of really interesting presentations, and unfortunately, I just have a boring slideshow and not a very nice documentary that looks quite lovely. Thank you very much for having me here at Tufts. It's sort of a homecoming for me because I grew up right next door in Lexington, and my parents are here tonight. They're both Tufts University alum. So I'm really honored to be here and very happy to share the podium with one of my favorite and most impressive colleagues from the State Department, Dr. Tamara, Wittes, as well as others with whom I've worked, including Deputy Secretary Burns. Tonight I want to tie together a lot of what you've heard and step back and look at a major assumption and question that's really driving the foreign policy debate in Washington about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And you've heard bits of this question or assumption here tonight. And the question or hypothesis is about the U.S. government's leverage in the Middle East and North Africa. And the conventional view over the past couple of years is that this leverage is in decline. So in the next 10 minutes, I want to tell you why this assumption needs a little bit more thought and why it needs to be tested a little bit further, and I hope some of the promising academics in the audience can maybe help us answer some of this in the coming months and years. Just before I go through, leverage is a buzz term, obviously, and there's many different definitions that we could use in political science or international relations. But tonight I'm just going to use a very simple definition, which is the ability to influence outcomes in a foreign government, either domestic policies or foreign policies. So the ability to shape one of the Middle East or North African governments' decision-making, which is a lot of what we do in the State Department and in the National Security Council and in the foreign policy world. There are two types of levers that we talk about in U.S. foreign policy, and I don't think that the hypothesis about American leverage on the decline actually extends to many of our levers. In fact, what's not discussed is the many levers that remain very potent, very effective, very salient, and these obviously include military intervention. The Libya intervention is an obvious example. Limited military operations, the drones is another example. The threat of the use of force combined with diplomacy, meaning coercive diplomacy, is still considered quite useful, and the early September threat to use force in Syria is an obvious example. We can discuss it, and hopefully we will discuss it in this conference, but it clearly got at least Russia to come to the negotiating table with Assad and the Syrians in a way that hadn't occurred in the previous 2 years of the conflict. So these levers are not considered in decline. So this hypothesis or this conventional view is clearly incomplete. The other lever that's clearly not in decline is economic coercion, which was quite successful in pinching the Iranian government. For the first 3 years of the Obama administration, that was a major focus of our Middle East policy, was ramping up these sanctions in order to exert the leverage on the regime so it would feel the pinch of these sanctions, and they were quite successful. And the most interesting part was how unanimous the diplomacy was in making sure that there was collective European and Gulf and international coherence and coordination of these sanctions. So it's not these levers that are perceived to be in decline. So then what does it really mean, this hypothesis that leverage is on the decline, that the U.S. government can affect outcomes in a way that they could, in a less effective or less direct way? Typically, when people talk about this, what they really mean are some of the civilian, non-coercive levers. And tonight I want to look through 4, but there are many other levers that other of our panelists have addressed, including the work with allies that you've discussed. But the 4 I want to look at are the ones that are really the main State Department and the Pentagon, and these include diplomacy, both public and private, the whole realm of civilian assistance, training programs, And then the military assistance realm, which is very important, which is a lot of it run by the State Department, which people don't really know and understand. And then the fourth is U.S. leadership of international organizations, including the United Nations. These are four levers that, in my experiences in government, people are perceiving that our ability to influence outcomes through these levers is on the decline. But is that really true? So private diplomacy, this is what has made Bill Burns famous. He's brilliant at this. So yes, it is true that our very talented foreign service officers have incredible constraints to do diplomacy in the Middle East and North Africa. They have unprecedented security constraints that limit them from leaving the embassy and going to the meetings that they want. This is true, and this is important to protect them. And it's also true that there are new power elites in these countries that maybe do not have the same set of ties with the U.S. government and U.S. society, and that they're changing, so they have less experience, more importantly, in partnering with us. So that is all true. But on the other hand, there's a whole new generation of foreign service officers, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, who served in Iraq, who've learned Arabic, or quite familiar with the cultures and diplomatic norms of this region. And there's much greater familiarity in the past 10 or 20 years among the publics in the region with the U.S. and our norms of diplomacy. There's been an increase in the past 5 to 10 years of high-level visits, even below the Deputy Secretary Burns level. There's a constant parade of visitors at his level across the interagency, from Treasury, from Justice, from the Pentagon, from everywhere. And most importantly, a lot of our key policy goals are entirely dependent on this lever, especially the Middle East peace process. The private diplomacy, we've invested a lot in making sure that this lever enacts outcomes, particularly in that realm, but of course also in the Iran negotiations and elsewhere. So what about public diplomacy? Well, we haven't measured it, but anecdotally, there's incredible evidence of responsiveness to U.S. public diplomacy. And here I'm talking about speeches from the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, to remarks that are made daily by the podium, we call it, which is at the Secretary of State, the spokespeople at the State Department and the White House. Twitter and regional media instantaneously will pick up and changes of verbs and nouns and articles that we use in writing these careful daily statements. So that is at least anecdotal evidence, though what we say publicly quite matters because it's being read and interpreted and scrutinized. And privately, these governments consistently will come to meetings with us, the U.S. government officials in the room, pointing to language that we use publicly. So in that sense, the feedback loop is quite strong because clearly the foreign diplomats are responding and care about what is being said publicly. So again, this is anecdotal evidence, but there's some anecdotal evidence to support the fact that this lever is quite important, and maybe even more so. What about the package of civilian assistance? The constraints, of course, is that traditionally USAID in the region did this bilaterally, did it in cooperation with foreign governments in Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, and elsewhere. And it's challenging to be strategic when you're working together on this kind of development project with another bilateral partner. The other challenge is that our ESF, for reasons that Tamara mentioned, cannot be in the billions. They are really only in the millions, and in some cases hundreds of millions. But our other partners will vastly, vastly outspend us when it comes to the civilian assistance, and this is obvious in the Egypt case right now. The third constraint is that this takes a lot of time. We don't really have a science to it. Institution building, development, democratization, the things that we spend and the objectives of the civilian assistance are very long-term and very hard. But the process of investing in civilian assistance in and of itself is a good objective. The opportunity here is that these long-term projects, civilian assistance, including training and educational programs and private sector projects like Deputy Secretary Burns mentioned, themselves build a cooperation and is beneficial. And assistance is particularly useful and effective as a lever when our interests align. Okay, military assistance. This is a very important one in the Middle East because we have a vast amount of FMF and FMS, foreign military spending and foreign military sales. Here we can measure the input. We can measure the number of dollars spent, the number of trainings, the number of arms sold. But the challenge is the output. What are we getting for it? How does it change behavior? Where do we see militaries that we've trained and worked with change their behavior because of this lever? And another challenge here is that there are many U.S. strategic objectives tied into all these programs. And I've listed some of these here, we don't have to go through them, but we have our own defense industrial concern. We have American jobs that are on the line in the arms sales to the Middle East. And we also have an objective of trying to shape the threat perception and the capabilities of the foreign militaries. So you have to integrate all of these strategic objectives, and makes it very challenging to use as a lever. Finally, leadership of international organizations. This holds out a lot of promise. And on one hand, it takes a lot of time to build the sort of international governance regime that will change behavior. And the UN Security Council, working on the Syrian government, we've seen this over the past 2 or 3 years. It's been incredibly frustrating in the UN Security Council to work on Syria, in part because there are real differences of views on core international issues of sovereignty, stability, human rights, and differences of views of how outside powers should work in the Middle East. And this weakens the overall effectiveness of the international institutional framework. But there are also opportunities. The $2 billion we spent on Syria humanitarian assistance is not only trying to save lives and provide relief, but it could shape the outcomes potentially and help the U.S. image abroad. That's not the reason we're doing it, by the way, but it's a benefit. And over time, if we work collaboratively with the UN NGO, we can at least limit or attenuate the accusations we hear a lot that we're meddling in foreign affairs. So finally, I want to conclude by just saying, as I try to argue tonight, this question is not at all resolved. It is not at all true or known or concluded that our leverage is declining. We simply haven't measured it yet. And how would you go about measuring some of these non-coercive levers that I've laid out to you tonight? Well, you have to define the input. You have to define the dollar spent, the time, the resources, the diplomatic trips, the demarches, and you have to define the outcome. When is it that foreign governments are changing their behavior domestically, on political issues domestically, or on foreign policy decisions, almost because of these levers of U.S. foreign policy? And there is a potential for measurement. There are speeches, there are cables, there's all kinds of project-level assistance data on both the military and civilian assistance. But the findings would have to take into account that decision-making in the countries of the region is multivariate. There are many, dozens of reasons why leaders, transitioning leaders in particular, are making decisions. And so it would be very hard to conclude that they, President Assad or Sisi or one of the leaders we're dealing with is making a decision entirely because of their levers. We have to figure out how to deal with that problem. But in conclusion, I just want to emphasize, I think, what everyone here has emphasized. The popular view in Washington that our leverage is in decline becomes quickly an excuse not to act. And that converges with the 40% of the American public who are wary about intervention. As you can imagine, it creates a fatalistic, a cycle of neglect and defeat. So before we conclude or sort of, adhere to this conventional view that leverage is in decline, I would just urge everyone here as scholars, as thinkers, as practitioners, to start examining each lever and to ask these serious questions about how and where the U.S. government and our allies are having an impact. Thank you very much.
Dr. Rand and all panelists. In the interest of time, we're now going to open up the discussion to the audience. We encourage you guys to come forward to the mics located at either aisle and direct your questions to one panelist. However, I encourage the panelists to also weigh in if you have something to address with these questions, even if it was not directed to you. Thank you.
Let's start over here. Thanks again to the very distinguished panel. I'm so pleased to see two of my former colleagues from the State Department here. It's a great honor. My question is for Dr. Norton specifically. Sir, I'm a U.S. Foreign Service officer, so I can agree with many of Dafna's conclusions as well about how difficult it is to work in the region, but how worthwhile it is. Sir, you mentioned that we should be focusing on trying to attenuate the arms flow into Syria. There are some other challenges involved with that involve coordinating interests and maybe actions with some of our partners in the region, some of the major regional leaders in the Middle East. How would you recommend that we better go about doing that with partners like some of our Gulf partners, perhaps other countries that are very, very involved in Syria at the moment? If you have any specific recommendations on, there is a lot of engagement with these countries, but anything else you would recommend? And then very quickly for Mr. Leonster, as a European diplomat, you mentioned the importance of the IMF and kind of the United States and Europe providing more economic assistance, economic reform assistance to the region. What role can the other Arab partners play? Established countries like Turkey and Arab partners in terms of economic assistance that would be helpful to kind of supporting these transitions. You mentioned the importance of the United States and Europe investing heavily in the Maghreb and Moshe on economic reform and investment, tourism. What more can the Arab partners be doing, the established and larger Arab economies and perhaps Turkey in the same regard? Are they doing enough as well? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I want to clarify something. I'm taking it as given that the arms flow is going to continue. But my point was not to attenuate the arms flow. I mean, there's another question as to whether or not turning to arms was very smart for the opposition, and that's a debate for another time, and it's certainly an academic debate, unfortunately, at this point. But the point I was trying to make in my remarks was that the arms are being given on a very ad hoc basis. And what this does is create a situation where you have groups competing with each other. In other words, Doha and Riyadh have not been collaborating very closely in terms of how they're distributing their weapons. My point is, for the U.S. with major interest in this conflict, to use some diplomatic clout to try and encourage, foster, pressure our allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar particularly, to better coordinate the provision of weapons. There's another debate about what weapons the U.S. should be providing and so on. But my point is that the weapons are being given in a very discursive way, and this helps to feed, if you will, the divisions on the ground, number one. Number two, it seems to me that we have to be a little bit more vigilant about the kind of forces that are receiving arms. And some of this is done under the table. We don't see it. We don't necessarily have the opportunity to kind of observe it and know that implicitly. But for example, in Turkey, we have empirical evidence of weapons being distributed to Jabhat al-Nusra, which is one of the Al-Qaeda linked groups. I mean, we have photographs of this happening. So we need to, it seems to me, turn the screws much more than we've been doing on some of our friends in the region in terms of who's receiving the weapons. So coordination, and then the question of who's receiving stuff.
Yeah, we have organized new patterns of cooperation with a program of 5.5 billion for Egypt, 4 billion for Tunisia, and 3.5 billion for Jordan. Mainly focusing on job creation and youth. There are several problems. One of them is that all this aid is conditional, and conditionality is proving a very difficult thing to we work with these countries. Instability, governments, continuous changes in teams, 3, 4 governments in a year and a half in most countries in this region. A lot of problems with absorption capacity. So what we are trying to do now in the European Union is to see how we can overcome all these challenges to be more effective. Because it's not enough getting all these programs at the disposal of these countries, because it is not working. The economy is practically not moving or is deteriorating. We are working also in medium long-term measures in opening markets and investments, but nothing will work if we are not able to stabilize the economy in the coming 12 months, year and a half.
We can hear you.
Can you say your country of origin, sir?
Pardon?
Can you also say your country of origin?
Yes, sure. I'm Egyptian. It's my question for the whole panelists. I think it's regarding what Mr. Leon mentioned about the conflict between values and interest. About the U.S. foreign policy, it's supposed to be related with values. The people in the Middle East maybe have a different point of view regarding this policy. As example, dealing with the Mubarak regime, which is against the value of democracy, but it's helping the interests of peace and stability. Dealing with Iraq, how fast engaging in Iraq because it's human rights and try to release the pressure from the Iraqi people and use a patient policy with Syria, even with the 100,000 being killed, chemical weapon being used. and also in all over the world, like Rwanda, Myanmar, many other places, which is against human rights. So according to all what I mentioned, how you see the impact of all this in the credibility of US foreign policy in the Middle East, especially with other countries trying to play a role, trying to regain their role in the region. Thank you very much.
Maybe I'll try and take this on a little bit. Let me say first that at the broadest level, when you talk about values in foreign policy, I think any democratic society will demand to see its values reflected in its government's foreign policy over time. And if the society comes to feel, or a significant enough portion of it comes to feel that those values are not reflected, you'll see that in the political process. So you see, in elections, you see a change in direction. And I think that the president we have today came into office on the back of some very clear popular sentiment about America's role in the world, about America's struggle against terrorism, and American engagement in the Middle East. And he holds that very much in his mind, and he talks about it all the time. So at the broadest level, you are going to see those values reflected over time in who gets elected in this country and the kinds of policies they espouse. And policies that can't sustain American support will not be, public support won't be sustained over time. Now, as Bill Burns was telling us earlier tonight, life is complicated, especially when you're a global superpower. And all of your interests are not necessarily going to align with each other at any given moment, much less your values and your interests. But I've spent the last 10 years of my career making the argument that when it comes to support for political pluralism in the Arab Middle East, when it comes to support for more transparent, accountable, responsive governments that treat people with dignity and give them access to opportunity and allow them to be open to the world, that's something that is not just in accordance with American values, but very deeply in American interests. And I think that you've seen this administration, in the wake of the events of 2011, take that very much to heart. And it was articulated again tonight. America's interest in the region, at the end of the day, is stability. Stability is a requisite for everything else the U.S. cares about. And stable energy supplies to global markets, freedom of navigation, you name it. The U.S. needs stability. And the judgment of this administration very clearly is that stability will not return to this region without significant political and economic reform. So to me, this is interests aligned with values.
Thank you. Dr. Rand?
There's not much to add to that response.
If we could take the question over.
Ellen Dunkel, and I'm at the United States Military Academy for Dr. Wittes. What role do you see U.S. foreign policy playing in regards to leveraging support for gender equality in the MENA region and the means for stability?
Great question. Well, look, I think that the underlying societal trends that I was talking about in my opening remarks are probably the biggest factor driving toward greater women's empowerment and gender equality in the region. And it's both demographic and economic. Okay, when you're living in a world where young men who finish university and were promised that if they graduated university they would get a government job, have to wait 8 years to get that civil service job, that delays the age at which they can marry, the age at which they can move out of their parents' house, the age at which they can become full adults. Okay? That has a cascading impact on all of society. In Saudi Arabia today, where you have massive youth unemployment among men and women, you see more and more middle-class families with sons who want their sons to marry well-educated young women because they anticipate that they will need 2 incomes to sustain that middle-class lifestyle into the next generation. I think these demographic and economic pressures are fundamentally changing the region. The question is, what can we do to support and facilitate those developments and to help societies manage the adjustment costs, which are tough. But I think that there is so much evidence today from international development efforts all around the world of the positive impact that working on secondary school for girls, banning child marriage, the developmental outcomes these can have for societies as a whole, that this is one of the smartest investments we can make.
Hi, my name is Roland Gilla. I am a student in the EPIIC Colloquium here at Tufts University. My question is for Dr. Wittes. Can you explain a little some of the decisions and rationale behind the State Department's quieter response to the Arab uprisings and the Arab Spring?
Well, what do you mean when you say quieter response?
The more withdrawn aspect, especially in your approach to Egypt, but also to generally not taking a firm stance in the incident.
So are you making that argument about the entire arc, or are you saying that's a change that you've noticed and you're trying to explain the change?
Yes.
The latter?
The latter.
Okay. Well, first, let me make clear, I don't speak on behalf of the administration anymore. I haven't done that for 2 years, so I'll speak in my own name. I think that those underlying analytical realities that we've been talking about, the ones that President Obama articulated in his May 2011 speech, the ones that Ambassador Burns spoke to again tonight, those are real. But there are also a lot of near-term, particularly security-related imperatives. And there are these long-standing relationships in which both the United States and regional partners have made major investments. And if you think about it from the United States' perspective, Egypt has been for decades, for 30 years, probably one of its most important partners in every diplomatic, security, political initiative in the region. So the loss of that partnership inevitably is going to shake America's sense of how to get done what it thinks it needs to get done, even in a day-to-day way. It's not surprising to me that that's resulted in a lot of hand-wringing. The change in Egypt has been so fast and unpredictable, and that has exacerbated a degree of muddle, I would say, in American policy toward Egypt. But to me, at this stage, at least the near-term political trajectory in Egypt is clear. And so this is a moment when I think the United States can begin to take a little bit of a step back and try to develop a longer-term strategy. And I hope they'll do that.
Thank you.
I'd like to say a couple of things in response to that question, and also with respect to the question by the cadets about gender equality. There's no question that what one of our graduate students at BU, Holy Boulder, describes as adulthood denied is a very significant factor in terms of understanding the anger and the activism that motivated so many thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of young people, men and women, to go out in the streets and risk their lives. I mean, in the Middle East, and I would say in the Arab world perhaps in particular, you are not an adult until you are married, until you reproduce the family, and so on. So the fact that people cannot marry, they don't have a job, they don't have a place to live, and so on. These are crucial, urgent questions. And they're not going away, notwithstanding whatever magical thinking is going on in Egypt, for example. Two comments about U.S. reticence to call a spade a spade. One, I must say, and I certainly understand the tensions and contradictions of U.S. interests, but for example, the Obama administration's contortions last summer to avoid calling a coup d'etat in Egypt was embarrassing, and more important than that, it really underlines a significant amount of hypocrisy in U.S. statements and rhetoric. And it seems to me it's deeply damaging, perhaps even more damaging than whatever momentary angst would have been caused by a necessary cutoff of U.S. aid to the coup in Egypt. Number one. Number two, one of our closest allies in the region, the Saudi Arabia. And I know that the President is already going to have a very difficult meeting at the end of March. No question about it. I don't envy him that opportunity. However, our ally, Saudi Arabia, has been playing a malignant role, and we scarcely say anything about it. In Bahrain, we were on the eve, almost literally, of a deal which would have seen Bahrain transition in a significant reformist direction, in direction of a constitutional monarchy truly considered. And our ally in Saudi Arabia saw to it that that didn't happen. Moreover, the kingdom, which controls much of the electronic media and print media in the Middle East, has been relentlessly spreading calumny and accusations and charges against the minority Shi'i populations in the Gulf, and have fed what Bill Burns, I adore Bill Burns so much for what he's done, but what he somewhat inaccurately called sort of age-old Sunni Shi'i tensions. I mean, much of what's happening right now in terms of these tensions is happening not because of any kind of age-old sexual quality of tension and cleavage, but because of the activism of a major state and ally in the U.S. in promoting these kinds of tensions. And this is very destructive. And we see some of the venomous results in Syria. The U.S. has been very silent on this, even off the record, it seems to me, and that's a pity.
Hi there, my name is Kieran Green. I'm a member of the 2014 EPIIC Symposium. My question is directed towards Dr. Rand specifically. Over the past decade or so, we've seen the increased integration of academic disciplines as a tool of U.S. foreign policy. I think the best example of that would be the use of anthropologists in human trainings in Afghanistan. I was wondering if you could speak to the value of integrating a wider cross-section of academic disciplines in both gauging and influencing public opinion in the Middle East.
It's a very simple, very great question, and one that's very dear to my own professional trajectory, so thank you for asking it. I'm firmly a believer that all of the academic disciplines in the social sciences have a place and a home in the making and conduct of U.S. foreign policy. They enrich the discussion, they add rigor to the debate, both the published articles, but also people who can serve in both capacities. So the real challenge is to create just the process of making sure that the findings and the methods of the social sciences are packaged in a way that's amenable to very busy people who don't have, are sleep deprived and don't have a lot of attention span because they're working on hundreds of things any given day. So that's really the challenge, but there's no question that the content of the academic questions, the method, and the findings are enormously beneficial to and relevant to the real questions that we're asking.
Hello, my name is Chris Dowd. I'm a freshman here at Tufts. I'm curious if you could speak more about your 40% disapproval rating on U.S. foreign aid and the role of the United States as we move out of the sort of understanding of a unipolar world post-World War II into a more bipolar climate with China, or even merging into a multipolar climate. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the public opinion and how there was sort of an understanding post-World War II that the United States would play this world policeman role, and now how we're sort of losing that leverage.
Can you specify into which panelists this question is?
I would direct it towards Dr. Dafna Rand and Dr. Wittes, but anyway.
Well, on the poll data that I cited specifically, I actually just pulled my notes out so I could get this question right. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs does a poll of Americans on foreign policy attitudes every couple of years. And this is a question that they've actually repeated every time they've done the poll. So they have longitudinal data on this. And the question is, do you believe that it's best for the country to take an active part in world affairs, or it's best for the country if we stay out of world affairs? And the level in the most recent poll, which is 38%, that's the highest number we've seen saying stay out since right after the end of the Cold War. So and it does ebb and flow. And this is part of our foreign policy history. But we're at a relative historic high right now, and that's just something we have to reckon with. I think, it would be wonderful if there were greater burden sharing on all the things that Americans are reticent to continue making investments in. But the fact is that interests among those global actors differ, and there are going to be places where we can do burden sharing more easily, and places where it's more difficult. And I think that we had a great workshop at Brookings a couple weeks ago, talking to Chinese scholars about the Middle East. And it's, yes, this is a country that, given its growing energy demands, given its growing global prominence and its economic importance, cares more about the Middle East than it did a couple decades ago. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it has the capacity to, or the strategic framework yet to play a greater role as security guarantor in the Middle East. How we negotiate that with the Chinese is one of the most important questions I think the United States faces in Middle East strategy in the coming years. But I believe that because they're not, ready to jump right in, and we're not ready to walk away, there's a lot that we can figure out together.
I would just add one more thing, which is that if you were to poll Americans about the provisions of public goods that they expect of their government, probably in the top 1, 2, or 3 would be security. And interestingly, on the panel, we actually haven't talked about counterterrorism that much as a continuing, enduring, first of all, it's responsibility of people who've had jobs that you've had to protect their homeland. But second of all, it remains a very important national security interest in the region. And I think the job is, for this community, is to explain and make the case to the American people about the connectivity between Syrian refugee camps and aid to 15-year-old jihadists who are sitting in refugee camps all over the Middle East right now, and our homeland security. That remains a connection and a link that's real, and the next, I hate to be dramatic, but the next Osama bin Laden might actually come from one of these refugee camps. And that's not the only reason, but that's one of the reasons why the $2 million in humanitarian assistance is a reflection of U.S. values, a concern about the Syria. It's an incredible horror what's happening to the Syrian people right now, but it's also some level of recognition that the values and interests are aligned here. So the connection between U.S. national security and engagement in international affairs, I don't think if you rephrase the question, anyone would question that. And so without being instrumentalist or opportunist, the goal is really to show the connection between all these issues. Why soft issues, humanitarian issues, human rights, are an aspect of U.S. homeland and national defense and security. And the Pentagon, to their credit, this is the one interesting thing over the past few years, is really learned to see the ways in which these issues are linked and connected. And that's been something that's been really impressive as an institution for the attitudes. The bureaucratic learning that's gone on in the past 10, 20 years. I don't know, I don't have historical background, but I've seen it in the past 5 years. It's really
Sorry, I'd just like to remind our audience to direct your questions to the panelists.
This question is for Dr. Wittes. I'm Bernardino from Brazil, and I will quote Augustus. The United States will stand with the international community to make sure that there will be costs for any military intervention
In Ukraine?
Yeah. What potential costs could rise from the situation?
That's a fantastic question that I feel myself really unqualified to address. Not being a Europeanist in any sense, but so maybe I'll punt it to Bernardino. I don't know if you want to take that on at all.
When he said he was going to ask you, sorry, but I had a message that
On potential Western responses to Russian intervention in Ukraine.
Well, it's a debate we could also countries affected by the Arab Spring, because probably there's no solution for the crisis if we don't cooperate Russia. And in the case of Egypt, the Gulf countries. And the problem is that we have conflicting views, deeply conflicting views in some cases, and what the Gulf countries in the case of Egypt and in the case of Russia with Ukraine. It is going to require a lot of diplomacy, of course, but I don't think we can solve this crisis without cooperating with them. I agree with what has been said about the influence the West and the United States still has in the region, but it's obvious that all these actors are getting bigger, and their influence is also important in the region. The situation now is that no one has, I said that before, and I insist on this idea, no one has the possibility to influence and determine a direction, neither in Ukraine. Russians have been trying the last 3 years, and they failed. We tried it before, and we failed. And if we try now to do it, I don't think it will work. So the only chance, the only possibility is to reach an understanding with them. It seems almost impossible, but it is the only possibility you have. So we have to work very hard.
Hi, my name is Malik. I'm from Peking University in China. I have a question for Dr. Wittes. You mentioned that only focusing on narrow interest of the U.S.
Sir, can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Okay.
Ambassador Saban, before you leave, and I know you, I'm sorry, I just want to thank you deeply on behalf of the Institute for Bernardino's presence here and to acknowledge that. We switched all kinds of acknowledgments because of the issue of when people were to speak. But I didn't want you to leave without being acknowledged, and we're just very proud.
You may have heard my phone ring. It was my wife, so I have to leave. But I will tell you, you're blessed to have Europe's finest diplomat.
I think he feels the same way reciprocally about you.
I'll let him say that.
Sorry, sir.
You mentioned that China is doing more about their region. So, do you think, so to what extent or specific thing, China and the U.S. may have some potential cooperation opportunities in that region to protect or secure U.S. interests in that region?
Well, I think the most important example that is already very visible is cooperation not only U.S.-China but amongst the P5 on Iran, and Dafna spoke about economic coercion and the impact of sanctions. And there's no question in my mind that the Chinese decision not only to support sanctions in the UN, but to engage actively in figuring out ways it could help clarify the choices for the Iranian government played a significant role in getting us to where we are today with an active set of negotiations to try and resolve the concerns over Iran's nuclear program. So I think that's already an arena where through a lot of U.S., Chinese, and P5 dialogue and common strategy, and then each party doing its part, we've made significant progress in trying to get a peaceful resolution of an incredibly dangerous problem. The question, I think, is, for China as it contemplates where it goes from here on an issue like Iran. For China, for such a long time, peaceful resolution of disputes and non-interventionism have been primary components of China's role in the UN, on the Security Council, and internationally. And so if we go through this negotiating process and we conclude that we're not going to get what we need to ensure international security, what then? I think China, that's a difficult choice for all of the P5 and for the world. But I think that it's a real turning point for China, a challenge.
we have time for about 2 more questions.
I'm going to take these 2 questions, and then I'm going to take Sarah, because you're a segue to a very critical part of the meeting. I didn't realize that. If you can take these 2 questions, I'm sorry to be sorry out here, but there's something that's being more restricted. Trust me.
My name is Max, and I'm a student this year's EPIIC Colloquium. My question is for Mr. Leon. And as a diplomat, I'm wondering when you hear comments in the public made by the Saudi government suggesting that it may have to develop its own nuclear program if the international negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program move forward. How do you interpret that? What do you glean from that? I'm curious in your opinion, but also the opinions of Dr. Rand and Dr. Wittes as practitioners of foreign policy in the past in the State Department. Thank you.
Well, Saudi Arabia is not the only one. Unfortunately, there are one of the main reasons the United States and Europe to try to stop for years the Iran program is because if Saudi Arabia has developed nuclear weapons, you will see Turkey probably thinking of doing the same. You will see Egypt probably thinking of doing the same. If Egypt does, then you will see the Algerians probably thinking the same. So it could be an endless process. So what I think is the same thing we will think in the West, that it could be a nightmare. So we have to, this is why we have to stop, and Iran has been another example of very good cooperation between Americans and Europeans. The EU has played, Cathy Ashton has played a very prominent role in these talks. We are still working, it's not going to be easy. Though the agreement has been quite a good agreement, much better than what has been said about it. And I'm hopeful that it will be possible to stop it, but if not, consequences will be very, very bad.
Sure. As one sentence, the bigger question is the question of really Islamic practice. The question really relates to concern and fear of abandonment. Because there's no status quo in the Middle East, but there's certainly been a U.S.-Saudi relationship that's been an anchor, should be an anchor, and in some senses over many decades of history that we don't understand. So the question really is, on one level, how do you re-engage with the Saudis in this moment of time when they're deeply severe changes, domestically and a moment of opportunity for negotiation? And there, it's a whole question of reassurance while making it clear that pursuing these negotiations are very much in the U.S. national security interest, and we believe also in the national security interest as well. And standing firm for that, and not having to flinch, not having to offend it, and not having to make excuses. And that's very important. And I think our foreign policy state question understand that diplomatically, that when partners are concerned and feel abandoned or feel that something's being done in this case behind their back, in this case of 5+1, it's very important to stand up and say this is very important.
We'll take your question over here then.
Hi, good evening. My name is Ned from the National University of Singapore. So my question is directed at Dr. Rand. It's a bit more of a look at a bit more complicated issue of how domestic politics in the US can also affect foreign policy in a sense. So I think recently we've seen a bit of incidents where we've had quite big news to shut down things like that, budget issues like that. So I noticed that there are a lot of defense department cuts in research and funding with key program shutdown, things like that. And in that sense, I guess the levers you mentioned, the initial levers, would also be affected. And with the 40% that's been mentioned by the police, I think it's quite clear that at some point, perhaps you can engage in foreign policy without enough money for one and enough public support. So how would domestic events in the next perhaps 10 years or so impact the US ability to interfere in or even to advance its own interests in the Middle East and North Africa without alienating perhaps the voting population or making people feel like they should just huddle down this time?
This is a core question, and this is the key issue that's driving this view, that US, this perception that because of what's happening at home, there's less of a commitment or there's less military power. But here what's really important definitionally is the definition between the difference between power and leverage. U.S. power is still very strong, I mean, defined academically by economic and military power. It's still very strong, despite the sequestration, despite some of the cuts that Secretary Hagel announced earlier this week in the defense budget. I mean, we don't have to go into this, it's a huge tandem, but American military power is vastly outnumbered our peers in military power in this region. So the real question is, how do we leverage some of these particular trainings and assistance, and will they be affected by overall? And I really believe, and again, this is an argument, and people can disagree with me, but I really believe it's a perception issue. That it's really a perception as opposed to reality. You know, when you travel to these places, you see very robust American military presence. You know, originally in Bahrain, and we have our good fleet, and we have sailors, and strong cooperation with the militaries of the region. And, you know, there's some degree of leverage built into the presence and the power. So I think it's a perception that, and a misguided perception, that just because there's some right sizing of the defense budget, and there's real practical decisions and trade-offs that are being made in the name of good public policy, right, that American taxpayers deserve. American taxpayers deserve these type of hard questions being asked at the top levels of the Defense Department about what we really need to give themselves to our military first. That's, you know, that's the issue. But that doesn't mean that, you know, in reality, the leverage is going to necessarily decline. The leverage is a creative way to translate power into outcome.
Hi, my name is Sarah Arkin. I am a Tufts and EPIIC alum. I also had the pleasure of serving with Drs. Wittes and Rand in the State Department in Virginia. My question is actually for you, Mr. Leon. We've touched on how some U.S. domestic pressures are shaping our response, and I'm curious, this is a very long answer you could give, but if you could touch on how some domestic pressures, for lack of a better word, in the wide range of European countries that are engaged in the Middle East are affecting the regional engagement. We've seen France obviously elevating its engagement in North Africa, but we're seeing also growing xenophobia, economic crises elsewhere that are turning that way. If you could just hit on top 3 points.
Well, the situation internally is not easy in Europe. It's quite complicated, and it's undermining our capacity to intervene in this region. First of all, we have the economic crisis. Although we have been able, through the European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, to compensate a little bit the lack of funds in our cooperation, and we were able to have these programs I mentioned before, for more than 10 billion for the region. But there are more complicated issues. The idea of Europe as a project is also criticized by many citizens. We have our anti parties, the fascist in France, the Nazi in Greece, xenophobic parties in the Netherlands, in Austria. The coming European elections in May are going to be really difficult, and we may see a group of parties emerging, and probably the need for the center-right and center-left parties in Europe to renew the deal they made after the Second World War against fascism. All this is having an impact, of course, in the way Europeans see migration, and it's affecting how we're involved in the region. So there is a deficit in the economy, a deficit in political project, and all these produce a deficit in governance internally, and governance in the region. However, we continue to work, and it's paradoxical, because the new element, which is sometimes for Americans is difficult to understand, is that in the last 3 years, Europe has agreed to develop its own foreign policy and its own foreign policy instruments. We have now a European State Department, which is why we have been able to be more active in the region and more active in other scenarios together with the Americans. And despite all these difficulties, I think at least in the case of Europe, there's no option. The risks now some of these countries, I mentioned Libya, have a real threat in terms of Al-Qaeda having the possibility to go to Malta, which is just 45 minutes from of the coast, of the Libyan coast. So we have no other option. We have to be there, we have to go there, and hope we will overcome these difficulties. But it's probably more difficult to in Europe than in the United States. It's more than the 40% mentioned before.
I'd like to go back to the previous question about nuclear proliferation for a very concise point. More than 50 years ago, the U.S. was preoccupied with the idea of nuclear proliferation, thinking about the Kennedy administration. Go back to that period, you'll find a dusty book on the bookshelf in the library by Leonard Beaton called Must the Bomb Spread? There was a sort of image of a nuclear-armed crowd comprising the international community. But I think we need to be rigorous in thinking about what it means to have a nuclear capacity. And the Iranian program teaches us many things, and that is how complex it is to actually develop a program. And of course, it will make headlines if Egypt or Tunisia or Bahrain says they're going to develop a nuclear program. But there's a lot more to it than that. In terms of the investment of money, in terms of the technical resources that are necessary, the expertise, and so on. And so I think we should certainly avoid, if you will, the rushing to conclusions that announcing a program oftentimes is any more than simply a rhetorical flourish. The feasibility of such a program in many instances in the Middle East is very, very limited. Just as it was a bit of a fantasy in the 1970s when physicists like Theodore B. Taylor were writing about the prospect that the terrorists would get fissile explosive materials and go in their garage and make nuclear weapons. It's just not that easy, thankfully. So that's somewhat reassuring, I think, in terms of what we need to be thinking about when we're talking about proliferation. It requires an incredible investment of resources. It's few of these states are likely to make it.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Amjad. I'm a Georgian student in US Harvard College. My question to the Dr. Wittes. If we look to the strategic environment in general, it's very complex, especially in the Middle East. We call it in the army VUCA, when we analyze for the theaters, which it means volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's really complex. After United States shifting its policy toward Pacific, many dangerous emerging issues emerge in the region. Now we are seeing the extremist groups growing in the Syrian arena, and they are growing, they are getting well equipped and well trained. So what do you think about these groups when they are achieving their final objectives? Where they will go? Are they going to affect the United States' interest in the region? And do you think the U.S. policy, the current policy, which it depends in the diplomacy in the region, can the diplomacy by itself solve the emerging issues without support or movement from the army? Thank you very much.
Well, I think the underlying argument of my remarks tonight is that the notion of a pivot by the United States away from the Middle East and toward the Pacific is not viable. It's just not viable. And it's also, and we've discussed this a lot tonight, it's not actually happening in any meaningful sense. There are opportunities in the Pacific for the United States that this administration is keen to exploit. And I think it is working to do that through things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership through building up relationships where doors have opened in Myanmar and Vietnam, and through building up security partnerships. There's a lot the United States can do to seize opportunities in Asia that don't involve reducing investments in the Middle East. I think, but to answer your specific questions, the actors that you're talking about are already impacting American interests in the region. That's not a question. That negative impact is evident. And that's why you've seen the United States invest so much in dealing with the impact of the Syrian conflict on the neighborhood, including notably Jordan, which just got another significant loan guarantee investment by the United States during a meeting between King Abdullah and President Obama in California last week. So I think the recognition is there, the response is there. And you're asking, will it be enough? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure anybody in this room knows the answer to that. But the argument that I was trying to make tonight is that rather than sort of wait and see, it's crucial, I think, for the U.S. and regional actors to be as proactive as possible in making investments to contain those negative actors and to do what's necessary, including at a very fundamental level, to stabilize this region and reduce the space that those negative actors have in which to work.
This concludes tonight's panel.
Folks, stay put. There are many things I would love to say here. There are all kinds of internal realities here. Augustus Richard Norton came the very first year when he was a young instructor at the United States Military Academy at West Point with his cadets. That was the beginning of what you guys at West Point have now inherited. In reading your biography, Mr. Leon, I realized that you helped create the West-East Divide. And in our audience we have Nabi Boulos, who is the concertmaster of the Palestinian National Orchestra. The cultural depth, there is so much meaning here that we wish to exploit in the best sense of the word. Evinia, our deep thanks to you for enabling so much here, including the presence of Tamara and of our Ambassador Ford tomorrow. It was a great delight to my students to be able to say that Rob Ford was going to come tomorrow evening. And then we had to hit it with the bad news. Regardless, I would like to introduce now and ask the forbearance of the panel to stay put and the audience to stay put for a very bittersweet moment, but important moment in our lives. I'd like to ask one of more of our talented alumni, Nicole Sebecki, Nikki as we know her, to come forward and help us dedicate this year to the memory of Anthony Shadid. And likewise, Sharif Mansour, he will come forward. And we're going to do this in an expeditious way, but I hope an extremely meaningful way. Ambassador Burns told me that Anthony was very dear to him. I saw the response that you gave me when you recognized his name. I think all of us know what we lost in this context. But Nikki is a special meaning to me as well.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here. My name is Nicole Sebecki. I'm a photographer, videographer, and writer based in Nairobi. And I'm just going to begin, tell you a little bit about myself and show you some work that I did in Libya. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Anthony and read you something that was written about him. My time in the Middle East began when I was a junior through my fact-finding mission to
We got the
Lebanon.
lights, please.
With some encouragement from Gary here. I stayed on for a semester. I worked at the English language newspaper, the Daily Star. I was pretty untested. Never written an article or published a photograph before, but it gave me an opportunity to do so and to cover my first very minor conflict. To me, this is what makes the IGL so extraordinary. It gives you the support to get out into the world to take chances, and to learn by doing. After graduating, I moved to Istanbul, worked as a Turkey correspondent for Global Post, covering Turkey and the rest of the MENA region. And in early 2011, as uprisings began spreading across the region, I flew to Egypt and crossed by night over the border into Libya. This is the images you're seeing now. I arrived at Benghazi a week after the... Can we turn the lights down really quick? I arrived at Benghazi a week after the demonstrations had begun and found it in a state of animation. People were eager to show off how they had ousted Gaddafi's forces. Families toured the wreckage of the Katiba barracks and demonstrations filled the streets. For the next month, I followed a group known as the Rebels. They were a ragtag assortment of students, shopkeepers, and merchants who had rushed in to help the revolution. They came from different tribes, different regions, and different social classes. Some were experienced soldiers, but most were not. I covered conflict before, but this was the first time I saw a war erupt in front of me, or experienced the momentum of a nation in revolt. In places like Afghanistan, a media-savvy military imposed rules and boundaries to your coverage. But here, we determined how far we went and when we pulled back. It felt totally anarchic. Sitting there along the highway in the middle of the desert, no covers, our positions were alternately pummeled with mortars and artillery, and government jets flew overhead. The dead and injured were carried off in ambulances driven by volunteers. Optimism gave way to a bitter reality, and the rebels began to ask when, if, and not when Gaddafi was going to fall. The fighting took a toll not only on its combatants, but on civilians, large numbers of whom were killed or forced to flee, and on my friends and colleagues covering the story. This isn't a job that you learn in the classroom. You need to be out there. Mostly, you learn from your colleagues by watching those with more experience than you, and trying not to make too many mistakes along the way. I was privileged to be in Libya with Anthony Shadid, a New York Times correspondent who I'd met years earlier in Beirut, and the kind of reporter that comes along only a few times in a generation. My husband, Tyler Hicks, a New York Times photographer, was captured in Libya with Anthony and two other colleagues. And a year later, Tyler and Anthony were together once again on Anthony's last assignment in Syria when he tragically passed away. Tyler wanted to be here today to speak about his friend and colleague, but unfortunately he wasn't able to make it. Instead, he asked me to read this. I was with Anthony in Syria on his final reporting trip, and what touched me most, as always, was the genuine care he had for the people he wrote about. He was open and sincere. People wanted to talk to him, even those, like in Syria, who were in terrible danger. It wasn't just that he spoke Arabic. He created a connection that generated honesty, which Anthony then crafted into his journalism. You can't fake sincerity. For those around the world who knew him personally, or only through his writing, we've lost a great reporter and a true friend. His family, friends, and readers are now left with memories and the work he left behind, which is a gift that will never be lost or forgotten. His work, so deep, will endure as history is written. Anthony was willing to accept hardship and risk his life to bear witness, and to tell the truth in his writing. The risks in Syria were very high, but we took them with great planning and caution, believing that it was worth it to tell the story of this massacre. He was full of vigor and inspiration in our week of reporting, saying endlessly that he could not wait to start writing. The end came suddenly on our way out of Syria towards Turkey. He did not suffer. He died peacefully, doing what he believed in. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Now I need someone to come and help me with this. Put another slide up here.
Jesse? Ted? I'm going to stop you dead in your tracks. Just to tell you, if you're receiving messages from police, that you are possibly figure out when you raise your hand close to the Stop us, Joe.
Jeremy, you have to speak up.
I'm just saying to you, Ted, deep appreciation and deep thanks. Proceed to hear because of you. So much is going on because of your generosity. Thank you. Thanks to everybody.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for waiting here all evening. It's, I know it's been a very, very long one. It's my great pleasure to celebrate two dear friends of mine this evening. I think if I press the right button here. This is a photograph of Alexandra Boulard. Alexandra was a great friend of mine. She founded the 7th Photo Agency with me. And she passed away in her sleep in 2007, aged 45. Alex was a National Geographic photographer who really advanced the presence of women in photojournalism, particularly women who covered war and conflict. And she inspired many young women, indeed many young men, to follow in her footsteps. She also advanced the representation of women in the media. Alex was incredibly courageous, unbelievably courageous actually, had a very graceful intelligence, an elegance of mind, and a very vigorous curiosity. Something that the recipient of the award that we are giving in her name shares with her. So this year, for the second time only, the IGL has decided to confer an award in Alexandra's name. And we're celebrating a young woman, a graduate of Tufts, who has also advanced the presence of women in photojournalism. She's photographed the wars in Afghanistan and Libya, human rights issues in South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, working for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Times of London, the Guardian, Le Monde, and other media worldwide. She's based in Kenya, working for Agence France Presse. And Nikki, if I can ask you to come up here to accept the Alexandra Boulard Award. This is a significant IOU that I signed, but actually you're going to have to go to Sherman to collect it. And these people are my witness. And we'll print a lovelier version of this for you.
I'm humbled because I've been a huge fan of Alex's work for a long time. She was a huge inspiration to me personally, and I actually remember meeting her here in this room, and she gave a wonderful talk, and then Gary actually asked her some tough questions, which she answered with grace and honesty, and the way she spoke about the challenges of the work that she did and how it inspired her was something that I've carried with me for a long time. So it's very humbling. Thank you very much.
The reason I was laughing about this earlier, I said bittersweet, because a wonderful Sarah Harkin named the precursor program, which still exists, the Exposure Program, as you named it for our photojournalist and documentary human rights project. And Gary just returned from being the chair of the World Press competition, is the director of our program on narrative documentary practice, and twice Amnesty International's Photographer of the Year, and we are trying to integrate many, many things here. So thank you tremendously for your patience, for the way in which we try to care about the world, to care about our students, and why Carnegie, I think, is intrigued and interested in what we do. And now, it'll take just a few more minutes comes a really significant moment as well for us. Sharif Mansour, Sharif, come here, sir. Is an American Egyptian gentleman who graduated from Fletcher, had the good fortune to marry Jagar, who began our Iran Dialogue Initiative. I think you're doing your PhD in cultural anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. And the GAR began our new initiative for Middle East peace, celebrating its 10th anniversary. And in your 36-page, I love that double chi, brochure, you see what had been written by Rachel Brandenburg, who is also here, also a member of the State Department, on the history of MIMAP. So there's a lot of weaves that make a great deal of sense here, to us at least. I'm hoping that more and more of the audience that I can reveal with you realize the richness and the texture of our students, and we're trying to integrate them into your experiential realities and to try to create ways in which we can really bond with them. Anthony, Mark Rosenblum wrote a book, Who's in Earthquakes? It begins with the Knickerbocker quote, when people are running one way when everyone else is running the other way. These are the war correspondents. Excuse me? The madmen, exactly, the real madmen. Sharif is sane. But Sharif went back to Egypt when everyone else was fleeing to stand trial with his staff. These were people who were being accused by the Egyptian military government of inciting violence, of transcending sovereignty, because Sharif was the head for almost a decade, I think, with Freedom House's initiatives in North Africa and in the context of training democracy advocacy. Apparently a very pernicious thing to do. And Sharif is remarkably courageous and intelligent man. He is now the director of Middle East and North African Affairs for the Committee to Protect Journalists. And we first want to honor Sharif, who has written widely on human rights and civil society, who's been acknowledged far and wide in the Arab world, who's worked for the Ibn Khaldun Center for Human Rights and Development. And so if I can reach down here. Yes, I can. This is your Alumni Recognition Award from our university, from the Institute, and it reads, to Sharif Mansour, recognition of your distinctive integrity and valorous efforts to promote, strengthen, and protect democracy, civil society, and human rights in the MENA region. February 2014, on the occasion of EPIIC's 2014 International Symposium, The Future of the Middle East and North Africa. And as I think everybody knows, there's reciprocity. Here comes the reciprocity.
Thank you, Sherman, and thank you, all of you, for staying that long. I'm here on behalf of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and we have an announcement. Sherman and I have been working and figuring out a way how to commemorate and remember Anthony Sharif, and one of the things that we thought of is to keep telling the story that he would have wanted to be told about the Middle East. If you have the program, there is a cover page from the back. You'll see some of the things that he have done, including telling the stories of the Arab Spring. And we think that press freedom is in the heart of the Arab Spring. When Sharif made his sacrifice, he and 63 other journalists covering the Syria conflict have made us aware of what the conflict is, the magnitude of the numerous atrocities that took place, and for that we're always grateful for their sacrifice. We will have an internship started this year under Anthony Sharif's name. There's going to be a collaboration between CPJ and IGL, and we will have an assigned person advocating and documenting press freedom in the region, working with CPJ and IGL. This is our announcement. Thank you again, and thank you, Sherman.
process, and we're making you well aware of how this is going to happen. Nikki, Sharif, and all the legions of our alumni, they're all throughout here. I could not mention Matan earlier when Ambassador Burns was here, but Matan certainly works closely with him. There are so many people here. Our alumni are back. There's something called Voices from the Field in the middle of this large program, which will give you a sense of the people who have come back. They range from people who are in charge of teaching the students at West Point in counterterrorism, a military captain who is now on the Council on Foreign Relations in the civil military program, just many remarkable people. So I'm very, very proud of our alumni and what we're trying to nurture here. We have two last significant awards, and then we're going to release you. Can you handle this, guys? Augustus, is it okay? It is. Okay. The first goes out to Scholars at Risk. Denise, are you here? You're Denise? Yeah. Welcome to us. Intellectuals fleeing persecution and violence, and for your rigorous defense of the principles of unencumbered inquiry and academic. So thank you. So we'll find out for you, and we're just going to maintain this relationship. Next here is Russia. You can help us in that regard. We're going to be very. And since there might be some Ukrainians that are in need, sadly, we're going to be working with you for a long time. Thank you. Thank you very much. Then, as well, we have a wonderful reality here, which we will give out to the International Crisis Group. This will be given at a different time in this context because they have brought us remarkable expertise and the hybridity of their concern between inquiry and the passion of scholarship and advocacy is tremendously noteworthy for us. So this will happen at another point. But now what we're going to do, Dahlia, where are you? Please come forward. Dahlia, will you tell us your story? Who are you?
It's a good one. Okay, I know you're already tired, so I'll try to make the long story short. I'm the Executive Director of Ibn Khaldun Center for Development Studies, but I'm also a GMABer, which a master's program of Fletcher School, which is actually the thing I'm most proud of. I think simply belonging to this school is a big honor that everyone should celebrate every day. I am a human rights activist and women rights activist since a long time ago. I started my struggle with, or my fight for human rights and women's rights since I was 8 years old, fighting inside my family against FGM. Then this FGM is female genital mutilation. This afterwards was developed into fighting into the community in general against suppression of women and preventing them from reaching their goals and their dreams. Afterwards, I became a human rights activist, and I became active in civil society. In preparation for the January 25th revolution in 2011, I translated a comic book that was used by Martin Luther King in the 1950s to promote for his campaign for Afro-Americans to have equal civil rights. And later on, this book was given credit for inspiring young people in my region for adopting nonviolent action and strategies in making the revolutions. Well, that's it.
Alumni Recognition Award from the Institute for Global Leadership, Dalia Ziada, in recognition of your courageous commitment to human and civil rights, especially the promotion of women's rights and liberal democracy in the Arab world, February 2014, on the occasion of EPIIC's 2014 International Symposium. And there's one last 5-minute event, and then we're gone. Just vision. Aha, saw that. Saw that you have the obligation of your own intellectual autobiography. You're a friend of Rachel Berkefield's one of our alumni at Richard Wells, so
First of all, it's such an honor to be here. Good evening, and thanks for sticking around for so long. Dr. Teichman, thank you so much for having me. Mr. Teichman, thank you so much for having me. The short story is that I grew up in California. My story predates me. My family is Palestinian and Korean, and by way of a long journey of politicization, I turned my political energy, which was largely focused here in the United States on queer advocacy issues as well as anti-poverty work, toward Israel-Palestine. I became interested in those stories of leaders who were too often neglected by political leaders, by the media, but who were doing the heavy lifting at the ground level of moving their societies and their communities toward nonviolent approaches to ending the occupation and the conflicts. With that, I'm part of a team called Just Vision. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them in a minute after a trailer. And Mr. Teichman? Sure. We're going to look at this trailer and I'll be back in just a moment.
الجدار حسب ما جميع الإعلام كانوا ينافسوا بين فلسطين وإسرائيل. هون بدرس إنه هذا اكتشفنا إن الجدار لا سالب للأراضي.
The fence has, in fact, created a solution to terror.
اليوم أنتم مدعوون لمسيرة سلمية يتضامن معكم العشرات من إخوتكم الإسرائيليين.
So they've been trying to push the soldiers, but none of them could do that. I think the girls could do it.
لازم بدك تنجح تقيم مخك التقليدي.
كان في اتفاق كامل وكنا حابين انها تتوزع على كل فلسطين.
הוזעקו שוטרי מג"ב שצברו ניסיון בפיזור הפגנות וברשותם כל האמצעים לכך.
כולנו נמות, והנה האנשים סביבי, שאפילו לא מתחתים.
A nonviolent protest is not going to stop the ultimate way of defense.
This is a peaceful march that is journey to you right.
So thank you, Sherman, the Tufts Institute of Global Leadership, and of course Dr. John Mayer for his commitment and legacy to scholarship that's geared toward tackling the ethical challenges of our time. It's especially an honor tonight to receive this award in the spirit and memory of Anthony Shadid, whose journalism and coverage of the essential yet untold stories of the Middle East with both nuance and empathy remain a source of inspiration for myself and for many of those in this room. The award tonight celebrates the courage and leadership of Palestinians and Israelis who are building a future of freedom, dignity, and equality for both peoples in the region. I'm accepting the award on behalf of my team at Just Vision. Just Vision researches, documents, and tells the stories that you don't hear on the media, of Palestinians and Israelis who are working to end occupation and the conflict non-violently. We use media to disrupt the mainstream discourse on this issue and direct attention instead to those leaders who are fostering pluralism, dignity, and human security for all. The trailer that you just saw is one of those stories, which is documented in our film Udrus. Movements for freedom and dignity throughout history have shown us that when it comes to social change, communities lead. It's politicians who follow. At Just Vision, we believe that for any diplomatic agreement to gain legitimacy, it must have support from civil society leaders. And yet, too many of the courageous leaders involved in the region remain largely invisible. But visibility matters. To quote my colleague Julia Bosch's recent TED Talk, it's our collective attention that provides that's the fuel on which these movements run, providing their participants with the recognition, leverage, and protection they need to continue in their courageous work. That's where academic communities like Tufts matter. It's been such a privilege to work with this community, and I look forward to working with you guys along the way. At its best, academia is a place where theory and ideas meet practice. Our academic institutions play a vital role in advancing courageous scholarship, and students have frequently catalyzed mass social movements across history. Together as students and educators, you have the power to amplify the efforts of Palestinians and Israelis pursuing freedom, dignity, and equality for all people in the region. And my team and I at Just Vision look forward to many more interactions with you, supporting you along the way. Thank you so much.
We are a confusing bunch at the Institute. We have no ideological stance. We have no polemical stance. What we are interested in is trying to figure out the bridges of common grounds, trying to figure out how nonviolence could play into the interface of our world. But we are not a peace and justice studies program. We are very proud to have the Israeli Defense Forces here and their representation. And they've been very active in our civil military program as we try to figure out how it is that we can figure out a way to bridge what might seem to many people the unbridgeable. Tomorrow at 11 o'clock here, we will have an address by the Brigadier General of the IDF Policy and Plans, number 2 in the J5, and his name is Rami Ben Ephraim. He's becoming a friend. We're thinking of the ways in which we can possibly bring allies into Israel. And what may seem contradictory to people is not contradictory to us, because we're very interested in how dynamics can change people's lives and policies. And I think, you know, Dafna, when you spoke through the whole continuum of things that were possible in terms of coercive peace, negotiation, etc. Essentially, we believe in make peace with one's enemy. We do the uncomfortable, we're interested in the uncomfortable, we want to educate our students for ambiguity and complexity, and we hope that you share in all of this. I think it's time to say goodnight, and on behalf of my students and on